Hello, everyone. We are very excited to host Nathaniel today at the Learning Salon. Before introductions, a reminder, the Learning Salon is a now bi-weekly interdisciplinary forum discussing the bridges and contentions between artificial and biological learning. The audience is very interdisciplinary, so all of the questions are valid. If there's something you don't know, there's no dumb questions, just ask it. As long as everything is respectful, disagreement is also completely accepted here because our goal is understanding and not agreement. If you add in the chat during the talk something that you're not clear about, somebody might drop you a link. But if you have questions, we appreciate if you add in the ask a question area underneath the screen and vote on each other's questions so we can bring folks on screen. But also make sure to mention ask for me if you're not coming on screen, but note that it's less likely that we will get to your question if you say ask for me. So much better if you can join on screen at some point to ask your own questions. Another thing I'd say is that Sunday is the Persian New Year and the spring equinox. The exact moment of equinox is around noon. So if you don't celebrate or observe it, I recommend, being in nature, reading poetry. That's something that we do in that time. All right, with that, I'd like to introduce Nathaniel Daw, possibly my most frequent co-author, which I didn't realize until today. I was looking at and then what I wanted to say is that Nathaniel, usually in these meetings, we don't do a kind of a accomplishments-oriented introduction, but you're so accomplished, everybody probably knows you and all of your accomplishments. Something we usually have like a personal introduction. John, we would appreciate you coming back. Where are you? Okay, good. You're muted, but you are muted. What were you saying?
I was just making myself comfortable.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Hi, welcome back. So what I was saying is that we usually do a personal introduction. So I started working with Nathaniel halfway through my postdoc at Princeton while Nathaniel was still at NYU. And it turned out that Nathaniel's lab and myself, we had done different versions of a similar experiment. And we joined forces and started collaborating after that. Nathaniel's lab meetings were always one of my favorites because in addition to it being very RL oriented, we laughed a lot. There was a lot of laughter and going out with everybody to have drinks, which is something that I always considered a positive part of my experience at Princeton, because Nathaniel moved to Princeton at some point from NYU. The other thing I would say is that Nathaniel, when he was younger, he wrote a hybrid play that brought together Plato's The Republic with Reservoir Dogs, which I think it was called Plato's Dogs or something like that. I forget what it was called. Nathaniel can let us know. Oh, you're muted.
Republic Dogs.
The Republic Dogs. There you go. That makes perfect sense. The Republic Dogs, and that play was performed by our grad students at one of our off-site resort hangouts at Princeton, which was a lot of fun. And also he has a particular affinity for Nine Inch Nails, the band, as far as I know. So in that session,
when I was like 20, I did.
Okay.
Some years ago.
Reason, these are the things that grad students said about Nathaniel. So those are the things that we remembered. Okay. With that introduction, hopefully it was embarrassing enough to break the ice. I invite Nathaniel to share his screen, and hopefully it works again. Again, please remember, please remember to add your questions to the Ask a Question area and vote on each other's questions. Okay, if you go full screen now. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so go ahead. So sorry.
Oh, no, it's all yours.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I have no idea how to give a 10-minute talk or what I'm in store for here. And also I can't see, now my screen is full, so I can't see anything like chat or anything. So if you want to talk to me, then shout out, and that clearly would be great. Rather than try to actually present any real data in 10 minutes, I thought I'd just hit some high-level ideas that I think would be fun to discuss. So I'm Nathaniel Daw. My training is in computer science, but I've been working in neuroscience and psychology departments for many years. the title of this, I should say, Thinking the Right Thoughts, I actually stole from a podcast called Brain Inspired that I appeared on, and I thought his title was better than any of my titles. So it's a good podcast also. So check that out. Okay, so you might recognize this picture. This is a human Go champion, Lee Sedol, being completely destroyed and sort of shamed into retirement by AlphaGo, the DeepMind neural network that sort of mastered the first version of the network that mastered the game of Go, which is a sort of notoriously difficult computational problem. And one thing I think is interesting about this particular example is that the way, of course, that AlphaGo works and the way game playing computers, since the 60s or before, since Samuel's checker player worked, is by a sort of process of what you might think of as sort of model-based or sort of mental simulation. They know the rules of the game, and they search through, I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, but they search through many different possible paths through the sort of tree of moves to try to figure out which path will be winning. And of course, there are many different possible states of a game like Go, which is one reason it was so difficult for computers to crack it until they destroyed Lee Sedol finally. And what that means in practice is that anytime you play this game, you'll face a situation, a board position that you've probably never seen before, even a computer that's trained for many months, or a human that's trained for many years. And so what you need to do is figure out, what to do in, a new situation. And so the way we think both computers do this and we think the brain does this is by, or one of the ways is by a process we call model-based search or tree search or mental simulation. That is, the rules of the game and you search through the sort of tree of possible paths. And that's a very important thing. But what I'd like to stress about this example is, even though we're starting at a particular board position, you can't explore the whole tree of possible futures from it. A lot of the art and technology behind AlphaGo is being selective about which paths to explore, and that's sort of the P's on this diagram, are basically trying to figure out what are the most promising paths to think through. And even though AlphaGo, I tried to figure out how many positions it examined, and it was a lot, even though it used 48 CPUs and 8 GPUs in one version, and 1,202 CPUs and 176 GPUs in another. Even so, a huge amount of the effort has to go into selectively prioritizing or guiding its search through the path of future trajectories. So it's not just mental simulation, it's sort of guided or informed mental simulation. And this is all the more true of the brain, of course, because we don't have 176 GPUs. Our brain actually consumes 10 watts of power, which is less than one GPU. And nevertheless, it uses a pretty big fraction of our whole, metabolic battery. Something like 20% of our calories just go to keeping our brain going. So we're really constrained in terms of computation. So I thought it'd be fun to talk about how the brain solves these types of problems, or sort of search in the brain, or model-based simulation. It's something I've thought about for a long time. So the first thing to say is that even rats can do this. And the way that this is typically studied by psychologists and neuroscientists is using what computer scientists would call transfer tasks. So we basically exploiting this idea that to solve a sort of novel situation or plan or replan, you can use mental simulation. They expose animals to sort of changes in contingency. So you might let an animal explore a maze without any reward in it, and then separately, without letting him get through the maze to the reward, show him a particular place that's now his goal, where there's cheese, and then you put him back at the start of the maze, and you ask, could he figure out what's the right path to make? And in fact, animals can, and humans also can. And the standard view of this result, going back to the 50s in psychology, Edward Tolman is sort of famous for this sort of class of experiments, is that the way they do it is by learning a sort of map or model of the world, in this case, the sort of map of the maze, and then when they're faced with a new decision, they can sort of mentally simulate possible paths and figure out how to get where they're trying to go. So we do this type of experiment in people as well. Ida has done it, in fact. And we're interested in how the brain solves this planning problem. Now, one of the big issues with studying this behavior is that this planning is, of course, covert. And as I've tried to argue already, a lot is riding on which particular trajectories the brain thinks about, right? Like, it can't think about all of them, it has to find the right one. And so we're interested in the sort of rules by which it prioritizes or selects paths for consideration. But that's happening covertly, and all you get at the end is the animal turns left. And so so behavior is actually pretty weak for constraining this type of theory. So this is something where we hope that we still hope we can look in the brain for information about. I thought that would be kind of fun to discuss. Someone was just asking me yesterday when is the brain actually useful for this type of, or when a neural measurement's actually useful for this type of investigation. It seems like behavior is much more useful. Of course, John is famous for, I think, making some version of that argument. And certainly my experience as well, even though I'm a neuroscientist, is that behavior is usually much more informative, frankly, than measurements of the brain. But there's one case, I think, this is really a case where I think the brain is going to tell us. And I'd like to unpack a little bit about what I think it has to tell us. So there's a part of the brain known as the hippocampus that is sort of famously known to, among other things in rodents, represent spatial location. So neurons there are tuned to particular locations, and they fire when the animal passes through them when he's running around. And so if you listen to the neurons, you can read out where the animal is going as he runs around the maze. What's less maybe famous about these neurons is they also, when the animal's standing still, appear to represent trajectories that the animal's not taking. That is, locations where he's not, that form sort of coherent paths. And we think, or at least it's a hypothesis, that this is a neural substrate for the same type of mental simulation as, AlphaGo is doing in thinking through paths of chess, right? That this is the animal thinking through trajectories. And if that were true, then it could tell us a lot about how this works in the brain. So let me tell you a few things that you would learn immediately from looking at that. So this is an example of sort of one trajectory from Brad Pfeiffer and David Foster. This is a rat who's standing still. There's about 100 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, this whole thing happens. And what's represented is the decoded trajectory in the animal's brain. And so the turquoise dot here is where the food actually is, and he's about to run there. So after this event, he runs there. But before that, he thinks about running there, and then he runs there. And this whole thing unfolds very quickly. And so we think this is, potentially mental simulation in action, right? So what do we know from this? Just looking at this example, if we take that idea seriously. So one thing we know immediately is that this is a path, right? This is not a cone or a sphere. It's not happening in parallel. It's happening one path at a time. And sometimes the animal thinks about lots of paths, but he thinks about them one at a time. So that implies there's sort of a serial search, much as there is in AlphaGo, although AlphaGo has 176 GPUs working at the same time. So there's a limitation. Also, this activity is fast, but it's not that fast. It's maybe like 20 times, 10 times faster than the animal actually runs. And as I mentioned, when the animal's running, these neurons don't represent plans. They represent where the animal is. And so this activity has cost, in a sense. You can either think or you can act. You can stand still and think about where to go, or you could run and then you can't think about where to go. So there's a sort of cost or opportunity cost to doing this. Literally, apparently the animals are frozen in space while they're planning. There are a couple other things about this that I think are revealing or interesting. Is someone talking or just okay? One thing that's surprising about this initially, if you think maybe this is about planning, is that sometimes animals think about places and then don't go there. So for instance, if you train an animal that there's a shock in a certain place, he'll run up to it and think about running into it and then cleverly not run into it where he could get shocked. And sometimes people have the intuition, and people publish papers saying that this is therefore not planning, because planning is thinking about stuff you're going to do. But actually planning in the sense of that we're talking about, it's really evaluation, right? It's thinking about things you could do and trying to figure out if you should. And so that's actually exactly what the kind of thing we think this should be doing, and indeed it does. Yes,
Nathaniel, I usually we don't interrupt the short talk, but because you've got this figure up and you might not be able to put it up again. I just had a question about this. Funnily enough, I was getting drunk till 4 a.m. with David Foster on my balcony the night before last, and I'm very angry at him because I'm still suffering. And so, I've spoken to him about this, and I look at this figure, and I just have a question for you. I don't find it very convincing, and there are 2 reasons. One is, why is the little green line to the first target always there? Because the rest of the path is just essentially a straight shot. Is there an example that you can give where it really goes round the houses and remembers a place? Because this just looks like a straight shot to that point. That it doesn't have to negotiate, because the first green line seems to be already there. It gets to that target and it just does a diagonal to the target. So why does there have to be any mental simulation at all?
So that's a pretty deep question. So I think one thing to say is that to a great extent, although I don't think David would necessarily agree with this, since this was the premise of this paper, but I think the correct experiments have not been done yet.
So why are we overstating? I mean, what I'm saying is there's never, if I understand it, there's never one where you go 2 to the left, 4 right, round the corner.
Oh, well, so maybe David's new paper, he had a paper come out in the last couple weeks. So this is an open field, right? So there's not an interesting navigational problem in the sense of finding your way around obstacles, if that's what you're looking for. These dots are just a grid of locations where they could put food, but the animal can just run anywhere. So you're not going to find an interesting navigational problem in this setting. What you're finding here, I think, is the animal contemplating possible destinations. So I think it's even non-trivial in the open field of all the different places you could run, which one should you run?
Gaze direction.
I'm sorry?
It could be gaze direction.
It could be many things, but I don't think it's, I mean, the animal standing still, I'm not sure. There are cases where the animal's shaking his head around. That's a whole other thing. But anyway, what I was going to say is he has new studies involving a maze where they actually have, I think, bars or windows or something they put up to put barriers. And then these trajectories follow the barriers. They don't cross they don't cross walls. They actually traverse paths around the environment. How it relates to behavior is a whole other matter. Like showing that it actually relates to planning or credit assignment or mental simulation by showing that it changes the behavior is a problem that people haven't tackled properly, I think. But that's where this should go. I wouldn't argue with that. Does that help? Or
yeah, I just wanted to make sure that simulation is what we could posit as one possible interpretation of this. But would it be fair to say, looking at figures like this, it's by no means a closed issue?
I think that's right. In fact, there's a lot of controversy about what the function of this activity is, and yeah, I think that's completely right. In fact, as I said, some of these examples that I'm bringing up now are people's objections to the idea that this is planning, not the same one that you've just made, but other ones. But so what I'm trying to say is, let's posit that this is planning. If it were, first of all, what can we learn from it immediately, and then what experiments will we try to do a better job, and that's ongoing.
By the way, Nathaniel, don't worry about time. Take as much time as you need.
It's good. I'm about halfway through, I think. I didn't have a huge amount to. I thought I'd just set up the conversation. So my friend and collaborator Lauren Frank, I'm actually working on studies trying to study the involvement of this type of non-local activity in hippocampus in planning, credit assignment, kind of learning about how to get to rewards in more structured environments in a kind of more trial by trial kind of learning setting. But he's skeptical of this too. And in fact, the first time I talked to him about this, he not only raised objection number 3 here, but also objection number 4, which is that in his hands, he doesn't see this type of thing in many of his tasks at all, or very little of this kind of forward, so-called forward replay, trajectories where the animal's about to go. He sees a lot of backward replay, which is something that David Foster also discovered in his, I think, his postdoctoral or PhD work. That is to say, when the animal gets to the reward, the neurons seem to kind of rewind paths behind the animal backwards. And we know they're backwards because these place fields are directional. So they're actually kind of rewinding possible ways the animal could have gotten to the place that he is, where he's now happily eating a reward, let's say. So that's called backward replay. It doesn't necessarily rewind the animal's actual path. It can rewind paths, other paths the animal could have taken, like different turns and so on. And so what Lauren said to me is, well, this whole idea of planning is hogwash, because that's not planning. You know, the animals are already run to the reward. I know what he's doing. He's thinking backwards, but that's not planning. And so I think the answer to that is that this is a more general function than simply, as in the case of AlphaGo, what can I do next, right? It's also how could I have gotten here? You know, you find a reward and you're like, oh, next time I'm going to need to get here. What's the path from somewhere else to here, which you can find out by spooling it backwards, right? The general problem, I think, is, and maybe this is also part of the question, answer to John's question, is your actions and their consequences, the rewards, are sort of separated in space and time, and the brain has to connect them. And so drawing paths around the world, whether it's forward or backward or online or offline, this also happens while animals are sleeping or just standing still. They think about paths that don't start or end where they are. And so I think that there's a more general notion of planning that could explain this, or that if this is planning, it would have to be a more general form of planning that incorporates this, which includes offline planning and thinking, you know, sort of dreaming about possible paths, decisions you might have to make in the future, and pushing rewards around the world, pushing information about rewards around the world. Okay. The other thing I want to stress that comes out of this, again, this very simple example, just taking seriously the idea that maybe what we're seeing in this, you know, anecdote, or this image is planning, is that even more so than the case of AlphaGo, selection is going to be incredibly important, right? The animal can only think about one thing at a time. It's not that fast. It can only do it when he's standing still. So, and he can think about anything he wants. He doesn't have to think about where he's going to go next. Apparently, thinks about a place he could have come from, or dreams about other mazes altogether. So altogether, there's this huge sort of prioritization problem of which are the things in the world should I be thinking about now. And so I'm not going to unpack this, but in collaboration with Marcelo Matar, who was a postdoc with me, we sort of tried to write down a first principle kind of theory of a prioritization, like what, you know, given what's happened to the animal right now, what paths should you think about? When should you think about them, forward or backward, or every which way? And that's based on a computational model that tries to assess which is going to be more useful for helping me make better decisions in the future that I'm likely to have to make, and help me earn more rewards. And yeah,
Nathaniel, one thing about that is that it's a normative model and not a model that maps
that's right.
to neurons, right?
It's a normative model. It's also not a kind of realizable process model. So it's not like we're building a better mousetrap here. You and Microsoft aren't using this work to build better computers, right?
So maybe if you could explain that distinction, and it doesn't matter that you will go over time, because a lot of folks might not be familiar with those distinctions. It would be awesome if you explain the difference between normative models and models that are either mechanistic or related to process.
Sure. I mean, there are many different ways in which we can use computational theories or ideas or models or simulations in neuroscience. And one set of ways of doing that is really more about simulating let's say the physical or psychological steps, right? So people who are, you know, with a background in physics might be interested in how are things wired up, such as this neuron fires this neuron and delivers spikes that cause things to change, and that's really about understanding the mechanisms that produce the activity in the brain and maybe ultimately behavior. That it might be called descriptive modeling or other things. This type of modeling comes from the tradition of computer science, where we're interested in, it's sometimes called normative modeling. What would a sort of ideal evolved agent do if it were trying to do this? If we posit some function and we try to approach it efficiently or optimally or something and try to write down from first principles, how is it that this problem should be approached? The goal is to find a kind of principled explanation for why things work the way they do. So in particular, in this case, what I didn't quite say is we tried to come up with an in principle sort of description from if the brain were trying to decide which things to plan about at which times and when to plan forward and when to plan backwards, because it was trying to find the food as fast as possible, because it's controlling a rat. What patterns of replay would we expect to see? And what we show in this paper is that this type of consideration does a good job of explaining a lot of what we know about how these events behave in rat brains. With the caveat that I think John already pointed to, that these aren't necessarily the right experiments to test this theory. You know, we walked into a literature occupied by other people having done experiments for a long time who weren't trying to test the theory that we came up with retrospectively. And so now we're working, trying to plan, you know, better experiments to ask these questions, more tuned to these questions. Okay, so that's kind of one set of things. We can also do this kind of thing in humans. And I wanted to give a couple, just a big picture example. We don't have anywhere near the same level of invasive neural recordings in people, of course, but we have various sorts of neuroimaging. And so we can, in general, see decode much more noisily and much more slowly activity related, for instance, to particular people looking at or thinking about particular categories of visual images. And so we can employ that to try to do similar tricks to try to figure out if they're thinking about different trajectories. So in one recent study, I'm not going to particularly describe the task, but we had people effectively navigating a maze involving different paths to sort of common rewards or common sort of goal locations where they get rewards. And the question was, how do they sort of push information? If I run down here from C to X, again, I don't know if you see my pointer, and then later on I have to run from the green box toward X or Y. How does information about the reward that got at X sort of propagate from X back to the green box? And the way we did this was by sort of tagging these locations with visual objects that the person saw as they traversed this sort of maze. And then we could look for representations in the brain while they were sitting at X or sitting in the green box before or after making a decision, looking for sort of forward and backward trajectories, analogous to the rat, but much noisier, to try to decode replay and see if it relates to behavior. And indeed, we could see both sort of backward replay where like they sit at X and think about, interestingly, in this particular task, all the actions seem to be at reward time, much as in Lauren Frank's hands with rats, not while they're at the start of the maze trying to make a decision. When they get to X or Y and get a reward, we could see that people were thinking both forward, that is where they came from, C1, C2, C3. If they came down that path, they would then think C1, C2, C3. And they would also think backwards, E3, E2, E1, about paths they could have come from. And that unfolded more slowly. And in this study, we attempted to relate this type of activity to the actual choices people made. So if I got a reward at X and then I thought about E3, E2, E1, was I more likely to make the choice of going down that path the next time I put you in the green box? Things like that. We've done other versions of this. So Ida, in fact, had a great study when she was at Princeton, making a similar point, relating a different neural measure of replay. This is now across subjects. This is offline replay. So this is people taking a break, doing more of a multi-stage task like the rodent transfer learning task I talked about before. So people are required to adjust their behavior to a change in contingencies, and we can measure, what Ida did was measure how much during a pause after that happened, when they were just sitting quietly in the scanner, did they think about the paths that they would need to traverse to adjust their behavior? And that turned out to predict across people now how successful they were at making the correct choice in the probe test at the end, just the way like you asked the rat to go left or right after you show them where the cheese is. So again, the key, I think, feature of these things, which we're also hoping to do in rodents, is really a test for a relationship between this replay and learning or changes in behavior, adjustments, planning, various choices. Okay, so I thought I'd say one or two more things. Maybe I'll skip this one so we can get to discussion faster. Just talk about one more. So one thing I've been interested in, others have been interested in connecting to this type of investigation, is whether these brain mechanisms might help us think about whether dysfunction in these brain mechanisms for, say, mental simulation and planning might help us think about mental illness of various sorts, and what's the sort of underlying, give us more insight to the underlying causes in the brain of the symptoms of mental illness. So one of the problems, of course, of psychiatry in general is that we don't know very much the way we do about other diseases, about what's actually gone wrong in terms of sort of the tissue in the body or the processes in the brain, whether psychological or neural, to give rise to these disorders, right? So there's a classic idea which is associated with people like Everett and Robbins and Claire Gillen, that some kind of imbalance in this deliberative process, and in particular how it sort of trades off against what's known as habits or sort of automatic behavior or model-free learning, that if people are deficient in deliberation and instead sort of behaving sort of automatically and thoughtlessly, that could be associated with disorders of compulsion, like drugs of abuse or OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. And we do have some evidence for that from games, again, sort of like the one I described before. So you have people solve these multi-step decision tasks, and we can diagnose to what extent behaviorally they appear to be engaging in this sort of model-based mental simulation putatively. And it turns out that if you also assess across a couple thousand people symptoms of mental illness, disorders of involving compulsion or symptoms involving compulsion across drug abuse, eating disorders, OCD, and other things, are associated with less mental simulation, according to our estimates from the choice behavior, but other types of symptoms like depressive symptoms and social anxiety symptoms are not. But I think that's a pretty weak idea, just theoretically, because it's just sort of saying that if you think less, you do dumb things. I think a more interesting idea that we're starting to get interested in is a sort of flip side of the coin, which is that, again, if really a lot of the action in the brain is about the sort of prioritization or the selection of mental simulation, if there's biases in that deliberation, or if there's abnormalities in which things are selected, then you might expect that could explain sort of a lot of the sort of cognitive, sort of more positive cognitive aspects in these disorders, things like worry or rumination or craving or intrusions and post-traumatic stress disorder. And not only that, it could connect these sort of covert sort of mental symptoms to the behaviors that are associated with disorders like drug taking or drug seeking or avoidance, because if you have sort of abnormal planning going on covertly, that's on this view going to affect your choices, and then you're going to have the overt symptoms as well. And I think that's important because, again, one of the problems with psychiatry is that the only way we describe these illnesses is basically as syndromes, just as lists of symptoms. And so it's like, do you have social anxiety disorder? Well, do you have 3 of the following 4, symptoms? It would be like, do you have COVID? Well, do you cough and do you have a fever? And it's just a list of symptoms. It's not clear what's the underlying thing that connects these symptoms, and in particular connects these sort of cognitive symptoms like worry and which is a sort of A here, and behavioral symptoms like avoidance, which is like D here, right? And so this type of theory, I think, might help us understand a common cause that connects these sort of separate manifestations of these disorders. And indeed, in other work, we've seen that behavior in our tasks that seems to be related, that's indicative in our modeling of thinking about very particular courses of action or events, that sort of biased replay or biased mental simulation, which is biased in a way that we think reflects the sort of content of worry or rumination. And so anxiety also affects choice behavior in our reinforcement learning games, and is enhanced to the extent that people report more symptoms of social anxiety. So anyway, that's a sort of a smattering of topics, and there are of course many more, but maybe it'd be good to have a conversation. And thanks.
Thank you so much. There is a little bit of a delay, so the audience will start to share their claps in a minute. So first of all, that was really great. Thank you for giving such a great talk that spanned both higher level as well as detail. So that was like an impossible job that you did there. Thank you for that. I think that since John has to host a dinner party at Cosine soon, he should go first so that we get him. And then we have already 4 people that will join on screen to ask their questions after John and I ask. But I think I will minimize questions because we don't have a lot of questions. John, go ahead.
Thanks, Nathaniel. I'm really annoyed that I have to host this dinner because, if there's anybody on the Salon, I really want to interrogate you. I think I need therapy, and I don't know this. I just don't buy this, right? I find it tenuous.
Okay.
I mean, it's, the mazes are never really mazes. They're quite simple. They end up being Y's and T's. They never seem to be real mazes that definitively make the case that they're simulating. I don't know what it means to covertly simulate. The example I've used on the Salon before, if I say to anybody here, close your eyes, imagine you're at your front door, how many left turns do you need to take to get to your bedroom? You have to look in your head and you think about your house and you think about its layout. And there, I believe you actually are simulating. How many turns do I need to take in my house to get to the bathroom or wherever? I don't know, your den. And then you go to your last example, deliberation. So in other words, we've gone from what to me is still not definitive evidence that the first person rodent is really simulating and choosing between those paths. After all, they've been derived by us as third-party experimenters. I'm not aware of an experiment that has actually stopped that and they suddenly can't get to the food with a causal proof.
Yeah.
So it just seems to me that it's not that it might not be true. And if I had to bet, I'd probably bet that they are doing maybe something like that. But it just all seems too rushed. We go from maybe they're simulating, it's not exactly very good data. You yourself admitted that the data are yet to come, but it's so tempting to think about it in an RL framework. And then suddenly we're going from overt little petty little path to deliberation. Why is this all being slightly prematurely overblown is what I worry about. Is that we're putting human words like deliberation on these paths. Why are we overdoing it before we've really shown it? What's going on?
Okay, well, so first of all, I mean, I think you would agree, I think we all agree that the brain does this, right? Does simulation-based planning. Like we all have.
I actually.
Okay, you don't actually believe that.
I think it's actually really hard to convincingly show, and I think there are, as Ida's done and others, there are alternative slightly less modelly ways of doing navigation. So
I did that work with
yeah,
Nathaniel.
right.
I mean, like, maybe one thing is, like, I take a very broad view of exactly what the mechanism supporting this type of behavior is. I think part of there's an issue with vocabulary. And we can fight about the word planning and the word deliberation and so on. And I'm not committed. I find it helpful to use those words to communicate with people, but if they have connotations that you're not comfortable with, we can work on that. And I guess another thing is, it is absolutely the case that I'm the first person to say, I don't have a rodent lab, right? And the things we can do in humans are limited. So, we're trying to figure out what's the right experiments to do and to get rodent people to do them. In the meantime, we're trying to deduce what we can from the data that they've collected, and they just weren't interested in behavior, right? Like the history of place cells, as you may know, it sort of comes out of the tradition of people, studying sensory responses. That effectively, it's not unlike studying a visual neuron. What people were thinking about, they found neurons that were sort of tuned to interesting stuff, that being location, and almost all the work, I think it's fair to say, had to do with trying to figure out how that tuning came to be. So playing around with cue cards in the environment and rotating the environment and doing this and that kind of thing. So it just wasn't a group of people largely who were interested in what's downstream of these neurons making choices. And so we're trying to reorient them to go in that direction. But that's going to take time. So we're certainly planning experiments and working with Lauren and Josh Burke and others. We are trying to do these deactivation experiments that you mentioned, where you can detect these events and interrupt them or bias them and things like that, and try to get causal effects. Even before that, we want to do the kinds of things that IDA's done in sort of cruder experiments, no offense, in humans, which are to connect this activity to behavior even correlationally, right? So in general, the only behavior we have, from examples like I showed you, is that the animal thinks about a path and then maybe goes there, or thinks about a path he came from. We'd like to see that if I were to posit a more operational version of what I mean by deliberation, it's connecting an action to a consequence over sort of separation in space and time. If it's the case that these trajectories are pushing information about rewards between choice points and decision points, or choice points and outcome points, we should be able to see that if I give you a reward someplace and you think about a path to somewhere else, or vice versa, that changes choices that you'll make selectively at that location compared to if that replay didn't happen or something like that, right? So those are the kind of experiments that we're doing.
Yeah, but until we do, why are we already saying that these animals are thinking? You just said it, they're thinking a path, they're simulating. And what I'm saying is that the evidence isn't in yet, right? And, let me give you an analogy. When a lion is crouching, ready to pounce, and its muscles predict the direction that it's going to pounce in at a delay, are the muscles planning? You could decode from the EMG the direction that they're going to pounce in, right? But would one say that those muscles are planning the trajectory of the pounce that's going to happen at a delay of a few seconds?
Sorry, if I may interject for a second. So I think there is a problem if one's imaginary is limited to the motor system and keeps trying to map it on, just because the kinds of systems involved are really different. And let's not use the muscle thing, and let's go back to your claim. I want to make sure we don't get distracted by
I'm just saying you can decode. No, I'm going to ask, but you can decode something that's about to happen without necessarily having to call it planning.
Okay, that's fair. Yes, let's put that aside, because that's.
No, I'm asking, why is it being called planning, because it somehow is predictive about
I
what
think
it's
I'm trying to answer your question, but you don't let me. You keep
Okay.
interrupting me, and we know that interruptions are not very good. So let's try to go one by one. So here is maybe I ask you first. So do you believe that hippocampal replay doesn't exist? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that it doesn't exist. It's something that experimenters have seen.
Okay, got it.
I mean, my thing to say, again, maybe I came at this in the wrong direction. In my own lab, I've done experiments, which I didn't unpack in any detail, where I've attempted to take the most stripped down possible examples of what I think operationalizes planning behaviorally, and we could discuss whether that's the right operationalization and so on, and connect it to events in the brain and connect it to other sorts of things. So, we could have the discussion with respect to my data and my tasks and so on. What do we know about mental simulation or planning or deliberation or non-local credit assignment or whatever you want to call it, as it unfolds in experiments that I think are more directed at the questions. Again, I will freely admit that we do not yet have comparable, basically behavioral designs and studies in rodents to test the, I think, suggestive and exciting possibilities that this activity in rodents is carrying out the function that I'm hypothesizing it could. So I do not mean to overclaim there. There's lots of people who think this activity is responsible for other things or has other functions and so on. There's a much more detailed, although in some way more limited, empirical case about mental simulation or whatever you want to call it in humans from Ida's work and others. So yes, the spirit in which I presented the rodent stuff was, if we take the hypothesis seriously that this subserves that, what does it tell us? What could it tell us about how this works in the brain, right? And that I'm excited to test that.
And as I said, if I had to bet, I would, if I really had to bet, I'd go to hell versus heaven. I would probably say that maybe they really are simulating alternative A and alternative B and genuinely thinking about them and taking A and B. And that would be amazing when that's shown. But I think there must be a reason why it's been so hard to show it thus far. And what I'm worried about is that you are being saying it's a hypothesis, but I can assure you a lot of people feel like it's more than a hypothesis. They think that actually we do have good evidence for simulation in animal models. And I'm saying that the jury is still out, as attractive as the notion is.
I think there's something that, John, you're saying that I think I might empathize with some parts of what you're saying, that we're not always simulating forward. And in fact, some of the work that I've done with Nathaniel was about that sometimes planning can be less based on simulations, and it can use cached, pre-baked, multi-step stuff that I have previously somehow saved in my particular parts. Like it could be the hippocampus, it could be that it's now consolidated into lateral cortices, wherever it is. It could be that prefrontal cortex is involved. We have some ideas, we did some experiments, but again, it's not all done. So I agree with you that not every single decision needs a deliberation like that and like a sequential forward simulation of the paths. I agree with you. However, there are some cases that does happen. And some of the things that, for instance, another paper by the Foster Lab was showing was that if you have a change in the environment, if the rodent walks around and has a change in the environment, it backward replays the trajectory where it came from, supposedly to update. But that didn't increase the forward replay. So there was no increase in forward replay, but there was an increase in backward replay. And so that was there was two different studies. One was anyway, I don't want to talk too much because you're leaving soon, and I want to make sure John Cooley is our rodent experimentalist. So I wanted to make sure, because we're talking so much about rodents, at least one person is here who does rodent experiments.
Hey, John.
Hi, I'm Nathan. Daniel. In the movie you showed from Pfeiffer and Foster, is very elegant pre-play of going 10 or 100 times faster than real time. But in that paper, they show examples. They're not 100% convincing of the animal exhibiting 3 or 4 trajectories before selecting one, which is what I think John Krakauer is asking for. And if that's not there in the tiger crouching, where the tiger is trying several things, that's really deliberation as the brain. So to be deliberation, the animal has to be selecting among a few alternatives to select to the one to act on. And I think that's pretty convincingly there. I mean, you have to judge the data, but it's not one trajectory.
I mean, I don't think that paper is convincing with respect to the behavioral function of the activity in the brain. I completely sympathize with that. I think that remains to be tested in the way that we've tried to test it in humans, and I'm trying to encourage all of the rodent researchers to do that.
But when I think of deliberation, it has to be evaluating several alternative actions and selecting one.
And is it doing that? I mean, was it?
Yeah, that's why I think it's clean. There is some evidence for that. You have to say, well, I don't buy that is real strong, but it's not the one path.
But we don't. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting question. I also think, again, my use of the word deliberation is meant to incorporate all types of, and maybe I'm overusing the word, things where you figure out, connect actions to outcomes without directly experiencing the path between them, right? So that's how I would operationalize the general problem that the brain needs to solve in these spatial tasks and other non-spatial tasks. You need to figure out what's the relationship between something I do now here when my brain's in one state and something I get later when my brain's in some other state somewhere else, far away in space and time, without getting to directly walk from here to there and just experience that relationship.
So doesn't the person have to be able to say, yeah, I'll do that, or no, I won't do that, because that's not a good outcome. There has to be a decision after.
Yeah. So it has to. So you would want to show that behavior changes. But for instance, the case of thinking about a place where there's a shock and not going into it, which I think is a sort of interesting counterpoint to the kind of thing that John's talking about. That you might think about only one thing and then just decide to stand still, right? That there's always the possibility. The question is, and again, this is not demonstrated in the rodent literature, does the thinking change your behavior? But I would also happily extend the realm of things that I'm sort of trying to understand under the rough rubric of deliberation beyond thinking about a place I could go or 2 different places I can go and choosing one of them, to things like the backward replay case where I get to a reward and I think about, hey, how could I have gotten to this reward, or how could I get to this reward next time, which is also connecting information to rewards, about rewards to possible choice points elsewhere in the world, but by a different sort of directional series of events, which serve that same purpose, but you might not want to call it liberation or planning, and I'm okay with that. That's the kind of thing I'm happy to incorporate.
Because mental simulation, just object rotation, the classic Metzler and Shepard sort of, is this rotated or not? And the suggesting that you really are having to sort of run the rotation of the object forward, and claim that you somehow are able to simulate the rotation of this complex 3D object. That's quite a heavy lift, right? And I feel like the words deliberation, deliberation usually means overt, right? I'm really thinking about it.
Yeah, I definitely have no claim about, I want to be operational. Like I never want to say anything about whether it's conscious or not. I think John and I might not agree about that, but I'd say the other John, but.
Which John?
Yeah. So I'm just, and also the other thing I wanted to ask you is, you can either sort of, like the great work you guys did together, right? Is this more like a successor representation? Is this really model-based? And you do it based on really smart behavioral experiments. And then you've got this little lift that you get, as you said in your talk. Here's a great example of maybe where I can use the paths to make more of a model-based kind of claim. But it is proving, tell me, and I'm not asking polemically, it does prove quite hard to make a definitive argument in rodents for pure model-based behavior versus alternatives. Do you consider that true, that it still can be quite hard to make a definitive case for, like a Tolman, that you're running this whole maze in your head?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say about the Tolman thing, I think it's clear. I think it's this is the behavior very cleverly demonstrates that the animal puts together information about the spatial layout of the maze on the one hand, and information about the location of the reward on the other to deduce a trajectory, right? That he tells you behaviorally. Whether or not he does that by sitting at the start and thinking through the path in order, or thinking through another path, is of course not demonstrated. But the question is, the behavior satisfies what I would call model-based planning of some sort. That is, it relies on the model. It demonstrably knows the map of the maze. It demonstrably knows where the reward is. It hasn't experienced how those two things relate in the actual trajectories of the world. And then there's a question: which of many possible mechanisms in the brain could support that? And I don't mean to take a strong or a categorical single stance as to which possibility supports that in each different situation. And that's the question, the mechanism question. That's why we need the neuroscience, I think, is to try to figure out what's going on in the brain to connect all the dots between all this information. The behaviorally the animal shows he does, right?
But are there, I guess what I'm asking for people, other people who might not be as familiar, there are alternative, more piecemeal explanations for the behavior without having to explain an entire state-by-state simulation. I mean,
yeah, but I like with IDA, I've worked on those. Those totally fall under the set of things that I'm excited about. So I don't think that's a. I'm willing to own that. I like that stuff. Like I'm good with that. If you don't want to call that deliberation, that's fine. But there's a much more nuanced conversation about all the different possible mechanisms, and I try. There's
and the reason I'm not, and the reason why I'm asking that, honestly, and again, it's not that I don't think all those things are really interesting. And in fact, Ida's taught me a lot about it and explained that this is the family of algorithms which have more of a spectrum of what you should call them, and that these dichotomies about model-free and model-based fail to capture the complexity of the number of algorithms that could do the mapping you said over the latent learning and where the reward is. Absolutely. I guess what I'm asking is, when one starts to apply it to like psychiatric disease and obsessive thinking and things like that, what I'm really asking is, of the family of algorithms that smear across model-free to model-based, and when we talk about deliberation, whether it's mental rotation or how many turns do I need to take, when will the algorithm of the ones that you are contemplating be a genuine foot in the door towards the more overt types of deliberation that we claim to be thinking about, that Kahneman has called System 2, right? In other words, are we on the way to a neuroscience deliberation of that kind, looking across this sequence of algorithms in these simple tasks? Is that the goal here? Or what I sometimes suspect is that we sometimes do rodent tasks in humans. In fact, we had a paper that just came out with Adrian and Yue about habits and skills, where we sometimes worry that people try and do simple lever press tasks in humans looking for reward evaluation and they don't really work. And I'm just wondering, where are we going? Is it at the far end of the spectrum of the rodent behavior? We're on the way to deliberation of the overt. I'm not going to go to this coffee shop today. I'm going to go to that coffee shop because they've got better pain au chocolat than over there. Are we on the way to that, or are these just similar English words for very different computations?
It's a great question. I think so. To be honest, when I started working on this, I thought that model-based computation was sort of a natural kind, and that, you know, we were going to be able to look in the brain and map model-based and model-free and see them pop up in different locations. And that has not worked. In fact, you know, or the flip side is, even the very, very simple behaviors that I think are diagnostic of this sort of easiest, you know, minimal laboratory examples of this type of reasoning are affected in basically every patient population we've ever studied, and, you know, involve all parts of the brain. So there's a sense in which I think they're computationally very well defined, but they're cognitively very messy. They involve working memory and hippocampus and attention and blah, 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 blah. So that's one sense in which it turns out to be a complicated story. And another sense is there's probably lots of different things in the brain that would fulfill the sort of computational criteria I have in mind. So again, I'm actually perfectly interested in really drilling down into what tricks does the rat use to solve these very simplest cases. Like, I think there's still interesting behavior going on, and the fact that it could be solved by some trick that isn't literally thinking through forward steps is still a very interesting computation that's worth really understanding. But there's probably lots of, they're very likely a number of different special cases, from, you know, verbal reasoning in people where I actually talk to you about the series of chess moves I'm thinking through, to more even unconscious associative kind of chains and so on. And so I don't think it's a single thing necessarily, and I'm not super fussed about that, to be honest. And I don't think that I guess I'm not that specifically fussed about conscious versus unconscious or something like that. I find that's a sort of a slippery topic that's not that interesting computationally.
If I may add something, John. So the work that we did together with Nathaniel, another person on it was Matt Botvinnik. And something that Matt Botvinnik always highlighted, and it's something I learned from him that I kind of religiously have to do, otherwise I'm scared of my experiments if I don't do this, is to ask afterwards from the participants, what did you think you were doing, and what was going on through your mind when you were doing, like, a whole debriefing. And because I had these periods of replay for people, for instance, in the scanning experiment on replay with Nathaniel, that Nathaniel was on it, but that's not the one that confusing. That's not the one that Matt was on it. That one, we asked them afterwards, what were you thinking about during the replay? And sometimes the answers are, you know, cliched, like they think they are supposed to say, I was thinking about the problem, and we don't really know. But you actually can see, based on their kind of how much they were replaying a particular part of the problem and how much that correlates with their behavior. That being said, in spite of the fact that they said what they were thinking about the problem, we don't know if those moments where we were decoding something from their brain that counts as replay were the moments where they were saying, I was thinking of it actively. So it's very difficult to dissociate between when the replay processes in human are reaching that kind of awareness level or explicit level, or when they are working in the background. And sometimes maybe we are thinking about the problem, but some other thing that is doing things in the brain is actually the one that solves the problem, and we think what we thought helped, but maybe didn't. So there's sometimes, I think, there is a difficulty for us to do those parts that you're mentioning. One thing we do know is that behaviorally, that period is doing something. There is computation happening in those periods.
Yes, yeah.
And that's, for instance, I think something beautiful that folks did was that if you give during the replay periods, if you're playing calming music to folks versus asking them to count backwards, and afterwards you have them to do the task, they're going to be worse when they didn't have the replay time because they were doing an interfering task. And so this shows that that period was actually important for the computation, in spite of the fact that they were, it could be that the moment that they're saying that they were aware of it is not the exact moment that we were decoding something from the brain. So I think the question you're asking is super important. It's not something we have a method to distinguish yet. We don't have the temporal resolution, etc. And also, the moment you start thinking about how you're solving something, you change the whole process of thinking about it. So it's very difficult to see what would be the way to actually test what you're saying. Maybe we don't know that. And so I think I side with Nathaniel that currently we're not concerned about the consciousness or explicit part of this. We're just concerned with, can these computational models, and which of them, with which properties, with which black and white versus kind of intermediate between these model-free and model-based thing properties, can capture behavior and neuroscience. So I think we are not as advanced as you think we are to claim strong things about the conscious part.
I'm not actually trying to play gotcha here. I'm actually trying to, I find it really interesting, whether it's deep neural nets and deep learning. I mean, you showed that picture of Lee Sedol losing, and saying he was massacred or destroyed. I actually think that what's really interesting that he managed to win a game. In other words, he does many, many other things other than play Go, and he's obviously not doing it the way that AlphaGo is doing it. And so what we would really like to know is, how is he doing it? And we don't have the slightest clue, right? Yep. And so what I'm saying is that what I find fascinating by all the work that is done in animal models, that there's so much intelligent behavior that can be done through tricks. And what I'm wondering is whether true deliberation, really simulating forwardly, is the final trick that actually 99% of animals in 99% of tasks don't need. In other words, there's so many clever tricks that can be done, whether you're a deep neural net or a rodent. They're intelligent, no question. I'm not questioning the intelligence, and I agree with you entirely that it's interesting to know what those tricks are without having to go for a full-fledged blow-by-blow simulation. But what I'm finding, and I'm willing to direct, is that every time we think, finally the full blow-by-blow simulation, a trick can explain it as well. So I'm wondering whether it's the fact that the dog didn't bark, that there are so many tricks that can do the intelligent work, that true deliberation, conscious, overt, is too expensive. It's too, you lose at Go if you do that, right? So I'm just asking whether we're looking at the amazing repertoire of RL-based tricks that allow intelligent behavior across the animal kingdom. And instead of keep using prematurely this full-blown deliberation, language, thinking, planning, we should say, actually, maybe that's just a special case. It's something weird that humans do and they end up losing. And that's what I'm sort of asking. Yeah.
But
Sorry, Nidhi has a question for you, John. Nidhi, go ahead.
Hey, John. So this is really interesting, this idea of, is it actual simulation or are there a series of tricks? It sounds like you have something in mind when you're showing this dichotomy. Do you have like a series of papers where people initially thought it was a simulation and then figured out it was a trick? Like, we
did it just, there was this idea that when you planned a motor plan, there was a very strong idea in the literature that you actually simulated with a forward model. Right, so the whole notion of forward model is exactly what a forward model is. You run the simulation, and then you actually, in the reaction time, decided between, with an opportunity cost, right? You ran the simulation, and actually it turns out not to be true, right? That whole line of reasoning that you had to run a simulation wasn't actually true. So all I'm saying is that it depends if you think the glass is half empty or half full, which is there are so many ways to look intelligent without having to really think about it, right? And look what thinking got us. We've destroyed the planet, right? Before, you could just do tricks and have your repertoire and do all these clever things and leave your ecology intact, right? So I guess my final position is, I'm not convinced that any of this repertoire of tricks, which humans do too, I mean, we do it most of the time as well. I totally agree with that also. I mean, I gave the example many months ago on the program, when I go to a hotel in London, it has 2 entrances, and I never know the layout of the hotel, but I kind of find my way to my room, regardless of which door I go through. But I can assure you I can't draw the layout of that hotel. I'm not simulating anything. I'm doing something much more rat-like when I go into that hotel. I couldn't draw the hotel out to you, right? So I agree with Ida that humans and her experiments do this too. I just think there are tricks. The world gets away with them, and then this weird thing that actually is deliberation, Kahneman System 2, is some weird later primate add-on that we don't really have a model for. That's kind of where I think. And I just get the feeling sometimes that we use the words prematurely, deliberation, planning, thinking, because we want to believe that these tricks are going to get us to the weird thing that humans do that allow Zoom calls like this and arguments like this. That's my current position. And I don't find anything that makes me feel like I'm dead wrong.
It looks like Ida wants to respond.
Yeah, I just want to say something small. So first of all, best code ever. Look what thinking got us. Look where thinking got us. We destroyed the planet. That was perfect. Something I wanted to say is, so let's take a look at what people think that what you're saying as conscious might actually give us. Again, John, please keep in mind, we are not as much, in the phenomenology or the consciousness of things. We are more on the computational side of things, right? So as long as some computational account compared to other computational accounts better captures behavior and neurons, we have consider that a win for us, right? What you're asking is obviously a lot more demanding, but let's see what other folks are talking about. One thing that actually some folks in AI really like is this idea of global workspace, that if the problem is so difficult that many different parts of the brain need to simultaneously work on it and integrate the solution, then it helps for it to be broadcasted everywhere. And so they say that maybe that's the reason for consciousness. Some other folks had suggested HOT, higher order thought theory, that you need to think about thinking and you need to have that higher order thing. That was another theory of it. Some other theory was that it's about complexity. There is a complexity phi, and that's Edelman-Antononi, and then you can measure how much the complexity of the neural networks talking to parts of the neural network, talking to each other in order to solve a problem is. And they said that's phi. And then, but none of them exactly captures where that threshold of the phi is, like where is exactly, what complexity captures that, because the experiments they had done were with few neurons. And obviously they can't do it with like as many neurons, billions of neurons. So it seems like something that converges in all of this is situations where you need to have some kind of thinking about thinking, right? Or some kind of, you need to broadcast to everywhere so that they can compete, and then you can choose from in terms of like what's the best solution, get the louder or the better one or whatnot. That being said, we still don't know whether, as you're saying, the better solution was some trick that didn't need this, right? So there is still a challenge. There is still a challenge towards what you're saying. That's why we are on the side of a much more modest approach, which is which of the models can capture behavior and neuroscience better. And on that, I want to mention work by one of my colleagues, Siddhartha Sen. What he's interested in is he found out that many AI solutions to chess don't look human-like. Like if you show it to a chess master and you say, hey, here to a grandmaster and say, hey, here's the solution, they would say, this doesn't look natural to me. This doesn't look like a human-like solution to me. So one thing they're trying to do, it's not the conscious part, is they're trying to build at least AI that still solves chess and plays it at high level, but shows human-like solutions as opposed to solutions that wins over humans but doesn't look natural, right? So there are different levels of these models. What Sid is doing is still not getting to a consciousness question, but it's still a step further than the AlphaGo and the current chess approaches, because it's saying, what would it make it look human-like as opposed to just winning some score, right? It's all like tiny steps, each of them, but I feel like you're overestimating how many steps we've already taken.
And just to the choosing. Let's say that it turns out that David Foster proves that it really does look like you simulate one trajectory in a complex maze with obstacles versus another, and you pick one, and then Nathaniel goes in and optogenetically inactivates, and suddenly they make the wrong choice. Let's say that all works out. It still would be nice to know whether that is along the way to, abduction, inference to the best explanation, right? Where you choose the most likely explanation for something that you see, right? The example of two friends who really fell out, and then they're both sitting next to each other in the cinema, and you come up with a series of potential explanations as to why they're sitting next to each other. Now, is that kind of inference really just an overt version of picking the best path over multiple paths? I'm not convinced that abduction and inference to the best explanation is just an overt version of inferring the best path to take to get a reward.
John?
Yeah, I'm not trying to convince you of that, to be clear. Like, and in fact, I think I would even go further as to say the way you're defining deliberation is not really what I care about studying. Like, all the things that you're dismissing as tricks, as far as I'm concerned, are the thing that is of interest to me.
Use the word trick first.
What's that?
So
you're muted.
You used the word trick first.
Okay, did I? Okay. Fair enough. But those tricks, I mean, I think they the successor representation needy. I think another thing that has been in the background of this is this thing called the successor representation, was live somewhere in between model-based and model-free, that Ida's worked on in particular a lot. I would be perfectly happy to call that, to a great extent, one of the major ways the brain uses information about the structure of tasks to evaluate actions. It is a bit of a shortcut with respect to the full, step-by-step tree search that AlphaGo is doing, and I'd be totally happy if that were the answer, or most of the answer. I don't think that's a failure.
Can I interject one thing? John Power keeps saying it must be a path to be deliberation. I don't think that's true. I think the animal could try a few tricks and see which one works out best and choose that. It's not a question of actually using a path, it's experiential path. Classically in shortcut learning, animals have to go across paths they've never visited before. And that can't be done by replaying play cells and that kind of thing. So it's, but evaluating among possible alternatives using tricks, whatever, is I think what deliberation is about. And I think that my guess is that this approach through the hippocampus will lead to some insights into that. Because hippocampus can be used for how animals could do long paths where they haven't been across everything, rather than these short apparatuses.
Yeah, I just finish, you guys, I don't really have an axe to grind. I would really like to see the extrapolation. I would like to see, the qualitative similarity. I just feel like it's still a bridge too far. And I completely agree how interesting it is to work out the neural basis for this family of computations that might all be tricks, but nevertheless, they're probably what we do a large percentage of the time, regardless of what species we are. And it's extremely interesting. My only objection is when I sometimes get the idea that winning at Go or Atari or doing these little mazes and using that we're on the way, and some people have written that reward is enough, that we're going to go all the way to general intelligence and deliberation. It's the overstatement, the overgeneralization prematurely that I object to, rather than the intrinsic interest in the work itself, which I think is fascinating. Of course I do, but I just don't think that the extrapolation claims, and that's what the Bailey-Mott syndrome is, right? When you push people, oh no, we never really meant that. That's just colloquial. We're not interested in that part. And then they go right back in their grants and their papers to do the extrapolation to claim that it's actually on the way to these more general. And it's that I'm objecting to, not the intrinsic interest of what happens in the process.
I mean, fair enough. I don't. I think that the minimal special cases that we're interested in unpacking capture something essential. I'm not committed to calling it deliberation. I wasn't trying to be provocative. I was trying to, or to make grand claims about things we'll be able to, solving AI or something. But I do think these special cases, are revealing and important. And Yeah.
Well, thank you. Barrage of, I have to go in a minute, but I hope you understand that it's out of genuine concern, not because I want there to be a divide. I just can't help seeing it. And of course it might be that I need therapy, but I just don't see it being the special cases easily generalizing yet. But
wait, John, I have to ask you, I think when Nathaniel says he never claimed that overgeneralization, there is some truth to it. And I think that the term deliberation, I think you're putting so much weight on it. Whereas in, especially for rodent, like if a rodent is standing somewhere and just looking two ways and like before moving, people easily call that deliberation sometimes, right? So I think you should consider in philosophy, something that we do, which I find very, very helpful, is to have a word and say strong and that word and weak and that word.
I agree, yeah.
So there is strong notion of deliberation and there is a weak notion of deliberation. I think that what Nathaniel is talking about is the weakest possible notion of deliberation. And what you're arguing for or you're ascribing to him is the strongest possible notion of deliberation.
I wasn't actually trying to ascribe it to, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. I think the weak and strong, I agree with you. I like using that too. I wasn't ascribing to Nathaniel that he was making a strong deliberation claim and hiding it in a weak one. I'm just saying the field in general, I think, does do that a little bit. And I think that the weak and strong distinction is an interesting one. And actually, you mentioned Matt Botvinnik. I remember listening to a podcast with Matt. I think it was Brain Inspired, actually, or Lex Friedman, where he actually said, this came up, and he said, I don't think we're doing deliberative reasoning at DeepMind.
Yep.
We're doing procedural reasoning. He explicitly said that. So he made the distinction very clearly in the podcast. And so I think that means that bit is yet to be tackled. And I think that's interesting, right? That there's a distinction to be made. And I'm just pointing that out. So I don't think everyone understands these weak, strong distinctions.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested to know when we get to that deliberative version, and that's just a genuine scientific curiosity, not because, that's all.
And to add to that, I think something I've never seen Nathaniel overclaim psychologically, actually. So I don't think he even cares about that word as much, if I'm not wrong, Nathaniel, as you might care about the computational processes that you're testing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited, but to a fault with the minimal operationalized cases, right? In fact, one illustrative example, I think, is that, a test that I've worked with a lot, one of my colleagues, Thomas Ackham, got rodents doing it, and they were really doing it well. And then he was like, oh, wait a minute, you can solve this with this trick, which in my view isn't the behavior, the sort of neural mechanism of interest. We've got to redesign the behavior to go after what we really want to go after. And 10 years later, he's still doing that. But I think he could have, it would have been a perfectly interesting question, and I think still the right question to see how they did the simple case, right? Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a research philosophy question too, right? Like, do you want to study? So Weiji Ma is another person who I've worked with actually on planning in much more complicated, or hopefully planning in sort of big tic-tac-toe games where you have to get 4 in a row on a big board. And that's a much more complicated task and much, but for the same reason, much harder to really get a handle on exactly what's going on than these very simple cases. And there's different approaches to attacking these problems for sure.
Thank you, Nathaniel. I have to go.
A pleasure to see you, John.
No, I really, as I say hi to Jan, I really appreciate it, and it's fascinating, and I hope we get to talk more.
Absolutely.
And I'll deliberate more over this minimal deliberative case.
I'll ruminate over it.
Can you though?
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Melanie, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Hi, Melanie.
Speaking of tricks, AlphaGo has a lot of very clever tricks that make it work well. one of them that I was interested in was what they called experience replay, where they basically, this was in the learning phase, where they, instead of learning from sort of like state action transitions that were temporally adjacent, they had a store of state action transitions and they kind of chose randomly from them to learn from. So to break up the temporal correlations, to make the samples more independent. So it avoided overfitting, because it's more IID. So that's a clever trick, that's is there anything in biology that does something like that, with sort of randomizing temporal order in learning?
So I think that's a great question. So I think my read on actually not even the AlphaGo paper, but the Atari one, is if there's a single thing that actually made it work, it's that, right? I mean, most of that looks to me like a sort of out of the box neural networks of the era. But it seems like the thing they had to do to get it to work was having these giant replay buffers and randomize across them. Because, as you say, of the correlation across samples that is induced by actually behaving in the world. So people associated with DeepMind, among others, and there's a long history of this in sort of cognitive neuroscience, take a similar view on the hippocampus and on some of the replay phenomena I'm talking about. So these also happen in sleep. There's arguments, which I'm not totally sold on, that it's pretty random during sleep. And so another story about what's going on, at least some of it, is that it's not prioritized for solving particular planning problems or something. It's just interleaved to do exactly that. And there's just, a set of stories about maybe a slightly different version, but the old version of this was a sort of systems consolidation story where you keep a buffer of all the individual experiences and then you replay them in random order or something to extract statistical regularities and learn those as sort of semantic memories in a different part of the brain. That's a very classic idea, and that might be part of what's going on as well. I do think it's, for whether you're trying to play Atari games or Go or extract semantic regularities, you would think that there's probably smarter things to do than just maintain extremely large buffers and be random, right? And so I think regardless of exactly what your position is on the goal of the computation, it seems like there's opportunities to be sort of more prioritized about it. And I don't think it's it's super far to, say that you're replaying this stuff to figure out Q values versus replaying this stuff to figure out, probabilities and a hidden Markov model or something. So I think there is a kind of relationship either way. And I guess I would imagine that both for the artificial case and the natural case, the selection is going to be important.
Maybe one thing, Melanie, that might be relevant is that some forms of prioritization of replay might be more biologically plausible than others. Mm-hmm. And so interestingly, I did a whole deep dive into where the term came from. And the earliest I find the term replay is in 1991 by Lin, who was at Carnegie Mellon at the time. And so it's a term that came from computer science. And then the first time that I saw it used was 1994 in a review article about complementary learning systems, where psychologists start to use it. And prioritized sweeping comes in early 90s. And until today, as far as I understand, a lot of them for prioritization just use reward or value prediction errors, so to speak, or some kind of recency. And so, for instance, I had a graduate student at Princeton who was my intern in the summer, and we submitted actually our work to RLDM, which is about using not just reward prediction errors, but also successor prediction errors to prioritize replay. And then we visualize what states are being prioritized. Turns out if you prioritize replay with successor prediction errors, meaning where you ended up was changed, then you actually prioritize replaying bottlenecks But when you're prioritizing using reward prediction error, you prioritize other states. So it was interesting, and it would be interesting at some point to have a meta-learning algorithm to see for which problems is which kind of prioritization of replay optimal. And I really, if I could bet, I would bet that the brain doesn't use the same type of replay for every single problem, and it will adjust what it's doing to them. So I feel like it's a little bit of a missed opportunity to not try out a lot of these things with biological ideas in mind. And then again, design careful experiments behaviorally and neurally to test them and tease them out. I think part of the issue has been that we have been so much at the mercy of what comes from computer science, and then we test it. And it's good to, like, move it the other way, like use neuroscience to build algorithms and test them. So I'm very with you that we need definitely to move away from just finding analog to sort of homologs to particular model components that came from computer science in the brain, and move towards proposing models that are actually inspired by something that we think is going on in the brain, even if computationally it's not the optimal thing to do. And that's something that a lot of my colleagues at Microsoft would talk about, which is that my colleague who's doing just CS, they really don't need to care whether their work is brain-like or behavior-like, but I do. And they only need to care when I have shown that something works better than something else that was inspired by neurons, then they care. Or if they want to do something that happens to matter about human behavior, but otherwise they really care about the score, right? So those of us who are actually from the other side, from the neuroscience side, I feel like there's an opportunity for us to create the kinds of algorithms that maybe only we care about, that they're biologically plausible, but they really will have their own lineage within this kind of interdisciplinary niche, as opposed to only borrowing from computer science and trying to attach it to the brain, if that makes sense. I'm glad that Nathaniel is nodding at this. Anybody else want to say something, or Melanie, before we move on to, I don't know, John, if you asked your question yet before we move on to Nidhi. So I'm just going to wait for Melanie, then John, then Nidhi.
I had one quick question. What's the speed of the replay in human recordings? Because I've always been somewhat concerned that replay in rats is 10 to 20 times normal speed. It's not the speed that I deliberate or imagine the path. It doesn't matter. So I think there actually are two speeds of replay in rats. Do you mean
the theta cycles and also the sharp waves, or you mean a different two speeds?
In sleep, during REM sleep, there's the slow replay, and during slow wave sleep, there's the rapid replay, which is similar to the sharp wave replay in the 10 to 20 times, about 10 times normal speed. But right. 10 times normal speed seems awfully fast to deliberation.
Yeah,
try to jump to deliberation.
If you mean deliberation in the conscious sense,
the way I think, I think I'll put it into a personal perspective.
Yeah, although it's also kind of multi-scale, right? Like you might think about going outside and that, to the where you're going to get dinner, and that it might be a very fast. You're not going to spend.
So I was asking, when you do it in the scanner.
Sorry. So there are two answers. The first is that the fMRI is, of course, too slow to actually. So the impulse response function in fMRI is 5 or 10 seconds. So there's people who would say otherwise, but including my wife. But basically, you can't see sequential replay in fMRI. You can just sort of see that something is replayed or not, or more accessed or less accessed. The data that I flashed up from this other recent paper used magnetoencephalography, which is faster, though has worse spatial resolution and other things, a different sort of pattern of pluses and minuses. So in that, let me see if I can get this right. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to. So Yunse Liu and Tim Behrens have done a lot of different studies of different varieties of sort of sequential reasoning. In this case, it's not actually traversing space. It's sort of series of abstract states that are tagged with objects. And I think in real life, those objects go by, 1 second at a time or something. The replay, the way we estimate it is that you try to, you're agnostic as to what the state-to-state delay is, and you're trying to measure, is there predictive power in terms of sequences over a series of these states at different delays. We saw we saw two timescales, both of which are really fast. I think one is, I could look it up. We can look in the paper. One was sort of 40 milliseconds state to state, which is really fast, and one is 120 something, which is more like sort of theta state to state. So, but both of them I think would be, sort of fast for the, much faster than the actual experience, and sort of fast for maybe explicit thinking as well.
Thanks. I'm going to sign
I'd
off.
love to,
Sure.
I'd love to know the answer to that too, John, though. Like how fast it is in humans replay. I think it also might have variable speeds depending on what kind of problem the person is working on. But it would be interesting. How would you test that in humans? Like what kind of, because we can't do the same thing that we do in rodents.
People do record in hippocampus,
I mean, I did, but we don't get as many neurons. Like I got 14 neurons in somebody's right hippocampus, and this was the best day of because usually we got even less.
Of course you did, yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe with MEG, so there are very clear peaks. I mean, in that paper, there really are sort of two clear speeds of replay that you see. We had a lot of back and forth with the viewers about it, across, consistently across individuals, and they have different. One is forward, one is backward, and I think one or both of these come up across a lot of Tim and Yunse studies that involve very different tasks but similar sequences of images. So there's something there, and we can measure its speed, but again, it might not be what John is looking for, or John Krakauer is looking for.
Nidhi, I think it's you.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great talk and discussion. So my question is mainly about, the normative modeling direction that you're going in right now, where you're saying, you want to ask the question now, how is it optimal to search through the possible solutions, and how does that potentially map onto replay? Maybe I'm extrapolating from what you said, and that's not what you really want to do. But my question is, so whenever I use optimality, at least in my work, it makes most sense to use it when there are many possible ways to do a thing, and it turns out that the subject or the animal is doing that animals in general are solving the problem using only a subset of the possible solutions. And so there's some kind of stereotypy in the way that the problem is being solved. Is there any evidence for some kind of stereotypy in the kind of replay that you see? Like, do they, and I'd love to know, what is that stereotypy? What does that look like?
I'm trying to think how to answer that. So I can't think of I can't think of a empirical fact about replay in the brain that I think corresponds to what you're looking for, but I think I agree it's very important. So, and people like Fari Cushman and Quentin Hoyce have thought about this more abstractly in the context of imagining how deducing how this must work in the brain. I mean, I think one way to say it is, again, if it's true that however fast this is, it's still pretty slow and you can only do one thing at a time and so on, it must be the case that in less stylized environments, you're only searching through a very, very small set of possibilities. And so a huge amount of the action is going to be figuring out which ones are sort of relevant to consider. So that's, I think the person who's worked most directly on that, but through almost entirely kind of behavioral methods, is Fari Cushman. And he argues that there's sort of fast processes to decide and also learn kind of which options are even relevant in the situation. And this actually links to issues in sort of moral reasoning and stuff, like which things are even feasible that you would consider and which things you wouldn't even bother thinking about. Oh, he was here too. Yeah. I don't know if he talked about this, but So that's sort of one answer, is that I think Fiery has looked into that sort of philosophically and sort of behaviorally. Quentin's example also is emotion, right? So we know that, so emotions are, you feel angry, you feel sad. There's a whole constellation of things that happen that are, adjust your behavior and your cognition to these different situations that are represented by these sort of states. And I think Quentin has a nice idea, which is just an idea, but I think very compelling, that one of the things that does internally is it serves to shape your deliberation. So when you're angry, you might think more about paths that involve violence or aggressive action. When you're sad or scared, you might be biased toward other types of search. I think that rings true, although I think it would be hard pressed to provide actual evidence for it. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? You might.
I'm in that embarrassing dream situation where I have to say, can you repeat the question?
Oh.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the question is basically, whenever I think about optimality as a way to explain sort of animal behavior, it's usually when there's many possible solutions, but that animals choose only a subset of those, that they could do a
Right.
lot of different things, but they choose to do a small subset of those. So there's some kind of stereotypy in the kind of solutions that are being found. And I wanted to ask, since he was
Sorry, can you explain
Nathaniel
stereotypy?
was
Do you mean like options versus policies in RL? If that makes sense, let me explain that. So policy would be left, left, right, right, right. That's like a very specific sequence of actions. An option would be an abstracted version of it. So it would say, go from the left part of the room to the right part of the room. It doesn't care whether you chose this path or that path or this other one. The whole point is that you get there. So do you mean that other more abstracted notion?
I think it can be abstract. Yeah, it can be, so long as there's, like, if even in the abstracted version of it, there's many different ways to be abstract, and you're choosing some ways, like that there's many ways to abstract the solution, and you're choosing like a subset of the ways to abstract the solution, right? That's where I feel like optimality really shines as a way of like explaining behavior. So I wanted to understand if sort of if in the replay there are certain things that you see the animals sort of clustering in a subspace of solutions in some way. I was not sure I understood.
I see.
Yeah.
So it is true. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ida. Actually,
no, you go ahead. I'll say it after you.
It is true that there are regularities, right? So there is certain. So one of the things in our paper about this that we try to explain is, there are particular circumstances when it's forward, or particular circumstances when it's backward, and it tends to cluster around these places and that places and not other places. So there are regularities in the content of these replays. They're situation specific. And we try to explain them in terms of our model, but I'm not sure that it's getting at everything that you're hoping for.
No, that's great. Yeah, I just wanted to understand like what that looks like, because you showed one rollout of the solution, right? It going like to the left and then down, and so I was wondering, what does sort of regularity look like for this kind of thing?
So one thing that I wanted to say that maybe speaks to what you're talking about is that we also have grid replay as well as place field replay. And while place fields are not the same, if you go to the same room that you went to 2 weeks ago, it's not the same place fields. I don't know how long it is. Maybe I should say 5 months so that we are sure, because I think that the studies that have traced the continuity of it differ. And also, if you go to a different room, the same place field is not doing the same thing it was doing in the other room. But grid fields have a lot of stability across different rooms and across time. And grid replay can actually go through walls and like imagine paths I've never ever been to, and that might not even exist, because of the fact that they just have a grid-like structure, right? After a while, if you overdo something, grid structures also get skewed towards a particular direction. So if you replay something too much in your head, that there might be an explanation for that, or even place fields. If you go through a path too much, or if you replay it too much, you'd get skewed after a while. I think I'm not sure about the optimality, because optimality is obviously in Bayesian sort of, it's a term in general that would be a different place. I'm not saying that the rodents or humans are optimal, because in fact, one of the things that makes some of the models that I've tested more human-like is that it makes errors like humans, that it's not as perfect as model-based solves a task, for instance, right? So it's definitely not the optimal solution, the human solution. But for me, the human solution is my optimal, because that's what I want to approximate, right? So in that way, I think there's a difference between the Bayesian approach, which wants to show that something is an optimal way to solve something, versus the idea of seeing if an algorithm is more human-like, for instance, right? In this domain, what I can, so this is just to address your optimality. Now, going back to the stereotypy question that you asked. So Nathaniel's totally right. The forward and backward replay, when there is a prediction error at the end versus your planning versus your moving and staying, all of that are some. Another thing is definitely the idea of grid replay versus place field replay being different. Another thing that I would say, and this is something that we explored in our computational work with Sam Barnett, who's a grad student at Princeton and worked with me, is this idea that we visualize what's being prioritized depending on what kind of replay priority you're using. So we compared vanilla Dyna with prioritized sweeping with SR Dyna, which Nathaniel, you should, maybe this amuses you. We're calling it dinosaur now because that's easier. It was a missed opportunity why we didn't call it that from the start. And then what we call parser, which is priority adjusted successor representation based algorithms. And then so parser can be Q parser, meaning you use your priority based on prediction errors in the value, or it can be M parser, which is you use your priority based on prediction errors in your state transitions. And then what we do is related to what you're saying. We visualize what did they prioritize, what did they replay a lot. It turns out some of them prioritize bottlenecks, some of them prioritize starting states, some of them prioritize end states. And so with, I think this answers your question to some extent. We can definitely, for a given problem, regardless of what humans do, figure out which one would be the optimal. And one thing that we are hoping to do next is like to do a meta learning to figure out in which types of tasks and problems, which type of replay would be optimal. And I like your word that you use, stereotypy, because then we can, for instance, if I understand it correctly, then the stereotype for prioritizing replay with successor prediction errors would be that it highlights bottlenecks. But the stereotypy for one with prioritized sweeping algorithm would be that it prioritizes earlier states. The one for Q-based parser, which is success representation but prioritized by reward prediction error or value prediction errors, that would be a little bit more spread out. So, and these different ones would take different times to solve the same problem depending on what they were prioritizing, right? So your question of what humans or animals might be prioritizing, we haven't tested these things versus one another in detail, but computationally now we have a way of comparing. But some things that we have observed, obviously not we as in like we as a field, because I haven't done rodent experiments, is like the forward backward replay, grid versus place field replay, and the fact that if you replay something too much, you might actually be better at doing it. That's some work that Hugo Spears, who was a guest here last year, had shown. There's, a number of things that we can tell. Does that answer your question? I tried to give as much background as possible.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that sounds really interesting. If you could sort of use those prioritizations to design an experiment where the animal is forced to prioritize one versus the other and see, then you'd have like an actual prediction for how the optimal replay would play out, and then compare that. That is really cool. Yeah, thanks.
Of course. And the bigger the environment became, like we expanded the environment that I designed in that study with Nathaniel, but we expanded it to many rooms. And the bigger it becomes, the environment, the more states you have, the more important these things become actually. And so you're totally right that we can definitely think of realistic ones. I personally work with humans. That would be the rodent part I can't speak for. Nathaniel, before we let you go, first let me ask if Nidhi has anything else to add. And you feel free to stay, Nidhi, if you want to add something in a bit or something.
No, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So great to see you again. And Nathaniel, you have a bunch of questions in the chat and in questions. Should I ask them? Like, what is your time like? Do you have time?
Yeah, I have about 10 minutes, I guess, if
Good.
that's...
So let me ask first Lawrence Hunt's question. I don't know if Lawrence is still here. He might need to leave soon because he's on, Europe time. He's asking, it's interesting that in Junge's work, it is roughly 1 to 2 states being decoded per alpha cycle, which I think is right, which I think is due to the classifier being trained with visual images, question mark?
I'm not sure I know what... I'm not so big on these... anything other than theta, I don't think I know. Is alpha a rhythm
12
associated with
hertz?
visual sampling in some way or something? Theta's
Maybe.
like 8 hertz or something, right?
Yes.
So I guess I don't have anything to say about that, but I wish he were here to unpack it.
All right,
I
let
think
me
he said
see.
he was going to bed. But again, what we saw a slow and a fast. I think he's talking about the faster one.
Yeah, yeah, the faster one.
That was actually not the one that actually turned out to be task relevant in our
Okay.
in our RL tasks. Actually, the
Mhm.
slower one, I believe, was I think that's right.
Okay, that's a clear answer. The other question is by Ayuno. She asks, how does your theory explain landmark-based navigation? For instance, go straight until you hit a park, then turn right.
So I wish John Kube were still here to talk about that. So my sense is that there's this whole two-system world that came out of the hippocampal navigation literature. The people actually do care about action. The place versus response kind of story, and the landmark-based navigation is, I think, thought of in a way similar to how I would think about model-free learning, and where instrumental conditioning people would think about habitual, stimulus response behavior. It's, although this is sort of imperfect, is associated with sort of coming to a particular landmark, which is like a stimulus, and then issuing a response. And so one way to go down a path is to take just to follow a series of responses, and that can give you a trajectory. But if you do something like turn the room around, you can get animals turning the wrong way and so on. Whereas these map-based strategies, which is with the hippocampus and supposedly more like model-based deliberation, are allocentric and work with maps and can handle things like rotation of the environment. Particularly after the conversation we just had, I'd be loath to take that dichotomy too seriously. I think that life is very complicated in terms of the tricks that live between these two extremes. But I think the traditional story that comes out of the rodent navigational literature very much parallels the model-based, model-free, goal-directed versus habit story, where with overtraining, you move from a place-based, map-based strategy that's dependent on the hippocampus toward a response-based, stimulus response type habitual strategy, or landmark strategy that's associated with the striatum, classically. But yeah.
That was super helpful. And actually, John Kubi says that he would have said what you said. So that's good. All right. Another question is by Sam McDougall, and he asks, pre-play replay in rodents is super fast, right? I'm curious if rapidity of pre-play in rodents is a clue that it is qualitatively different than human deliberation.
Yeah, so I think, again, this is sort of similar to the line that John Krakauer was taking.
Mm-hmm.
If by deliberation you have in mind, the language of thought, where I'm thinking, well, if I play my queen to here and then you play your, that's clearly slow. Whether things that rely on information about the map of the world that are also going on in my head when I decide how to walk out the door to get dinner when this is over,
mm-hmm.
exactly the speed at which those trajectories are being planned in my head, whether that's conscious or unconscious or some combination. I guess I don't know, and I'm not. I wouldn't assume. I don't think it's quite the same as like,
Mhm.
The voice in my head
Mhm.
talking through location. So it could be that fast. I guess I don't.
Wait, is there a voice in your head taking you to locations?
No, there's not. That's what I'm saying. But I think it seems like that's what
Yes,
John wants
exactly.
to call deliberation, right?
Yeah, I think that John wants a voice in the head, but he also is talking about therapy. So I need to call him after this to see how he's doing. One last question is by, I think, Daniel Stone. Oh, Samantha Walters added a question. How might someone's interpretation of the SNR of different situations affect the extent of replay? Maybe a bit of a jump, but could a feature of depression be an overestimation of SNR for depressive experiences that is then overly replayed? Interesting.
So that's interesting. So let's see. There's lots to say about that. You, Ida, have thought, I think, a lot about the ways in which beliefs about noise and volatility and change and so on might potentially drive decisions whether or not to replay. So Chris Gagne and Peter Dayan have recent work also trying to model PTSD, or in part, are talking about PTSD with respect to these same kinds of considerations. And it's certainly the case that, in the way that I think about it, and I think Ida thinks about it, and Peter and Chris think about it, decisions about what to replay and when not to replay are all, based on reasoning about your own uncertainty. Like, what do I know, and what could I learn if I think some more? What could I figure out? What might that buy me? How long is that likely to be worthwhile? Is it worth doing? And so it's going to be deeply affected by noise considerations, and including volatility, as I think has been your point, Ida. And exactly how that plays out in particular, disorders or situations is probably not well understood, but interesting. Yeah. So.
All right. So you wanted to end at 6, so we're not going to hold you any longer. It's 1 minute to 6 here on my laptop. Thank you so much, Nathaniel. I really hope that now that the world is slowly, hopefully there's not going to be another variant from Korea, but currently I hope that we can have you in person at Microsoft Research to give an in-person talk here. And so, you can meet again John and other folks here. Well, another John, by the way. So this is the Langford John. Right. I hope that we can have you over to have a conversation here. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for your great questions. And Happy New Year to those of you who celebrate Nowruz and the spring equinox. And if anything you'd like to say, John, Nathaniel, it's just so many Johns, confused. Everybody's a John unless proven otherwise. So if you have anything else, Nathaniel, that you'd like to share to close.
No, thanks so much for having me. It was a fun discussion, very interesting, very provocative, and it was an interesting event. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.